Let's talk about the clearance of lactate, how to get rid of high lactate concentrations. There are two scenarios when this is important. One is in training, interval training. You will likely do some kind of intervals or prescribe some kind of intervals, high intensity, threshold training, whatever. And in between those intervals, you actually have a recovery period, right? This is basically because intensity of the interval is so high that you break it up into small bits so that you recover in between those intervals. So that already implies that the recovery period is very important. And the recovery period is made up of two things, which is how long is the recovery period and at what intensity it is. Okay? And one purpose of that, or one of the main purposes, I would argue, is to clear the lactate. The other scenario at which the clearance of lactate is very important is actually in competition. For example, in cycling races, right? Cycling races are won by doing high intense effort. Either it's a final sprint, or it's an attack, or it's a counter attack. You basically don't win a bike race, as an example, by just steady exercising. Similar scenarios are true for some running events, where there's a final sprint or some attacks. It's obviously true for all kinds of team sports and game sports like football, soccer, basketball, and so on and so forth. So, long story short, in many sporting situations, it is crucial how good an athlete, meaning at how fast and at which intensity, an athlete can combust lactate that accumulated during a high intense effort. So let's have a look together at the clearance of lactate at different intensities. You can see here I draw the intensity on the x-axis starting from rest, okay? Just no exercise, no work, no intensity. And I draw already one important landmark or benchmark here, which is the maximum lactate steady state, LT2. Some people might want to call it more like an FDP intensity, doesn't matter for this example, okay? So at rest, sitting down, lying on the ground, not exercising, not moving, there's obviously some rate at which the body can clear lactate, right? If you would, so to speak, after an intense effort, just sit still, then your body would clear lactate, just at maybe not a very fast rate. So therefore, let's say we make one dot here. At rest, there's some kind of lactate clearance. Okay, and then this is the rate of lactate clearance, meaning how many millimoles or how much the amount of lactate per minute, per second, whatsoever. Okay, now let's look at another benchmark, which is maximum lactate steady state or threshold. So every threshold, LT2, like in terms of a lactate threshold, as well as the functional threshold power FDP, is basically a proxy of the maximum lactate steady state, short MLSS. What does MLSS mean or stand for? What is this maximum lactate steady state really is? It's basically the intensity at which the metabolism of an athlete is saturated with lactate, meaning the amount at which the body can clear lactate is the same rate at which the body produces lactate. Okay, this is why it's called maximum lactate steady state, because you will still reach a steady, constant lactate concentration, okay? But it is the maximum intensity at which this is possible, hence maximum lactate steady state. So, therefore, remember what I just said. The intensity at which the combustion rate of lactate, so the clearance rate of lactate, so to speak, equals the production rate, meaning the energy metabolism of the working muscles is saturated with lactate. Therefore, you cannot push any additional lactate into the metabolism, and therefore the actual clearance rate, so in terms of like our example here, you had a high intense exercise from a sprint or an interval, and can you clear this lactate at MLSS? No, because the energy metabolism of the muscle is saturated with lactate. So at MLSS, per definition, the clearance rate is basically zero. Okay, that should be pretty clear to understand. Now, what happens in between rest and maximum lactate steady state? And now think about what every athlete, every person who exercises will have experience, and I would argue does naturally, is that some light exercise, some not super intense, easy exercise actually helps recover faster. Here's my example. You do a high intense interval or high intense surge or effort in a competition. What is the natural behavior? If you don't, even if you would not have a training prescription, if you don't have a training plan program, what would be the natural behavior? Would you just stop, lay flat and wait, or would you keep moving? Walking, jogging, light pedaling, easy swimming, no matter what your exercise is. But in most cases, your answer will be, yeah, I would keep moving easily. Maybe you would, after an exhaustive exercise, stand still or rest for 1 or 2 minutes, but then you would keep moving because you feel that, it feels better. It's better for your recovery. So therefore, the lactate clearance somewhere between rest and maximum lactate steady state / threshold is not zero, obviously. And it's higher than at rest. And that's exactly what happens. So when you go from rest to a little bit higher intensity, first, the rate at which your body can clear lactate is increasing. So if you increase exercise intensity a little bit from rest, jogging, easy pedaling, walking, the ability of the muscle to combust lactate is actually increasing. Why is that? Because at these intensity ranges, it could be zone 1, zone 2, if you want to call it whatever, fat max, right? In these kind of sub-threshold intensities, the aerobic metabolism, which you actually need to combust lactate, right? That's the definition of combustion. You have some kind of oxygen usage to combust lactate. The aerobic metabolism is already activated quite significantly. But on the other hand, the actual lactate production is relatively low. So there is quite a big gap between how much your muscle could combust in terms of lactate and how much it is producing. And therefore, whatever additional lactate you had from high intense effort, you can now push and use as a fuel in the metabolism here. So going from rest to a higher intensity, clearance of lactate first goes up, but then of course, the more you approach maximum lactate steady state, it will start to go down again. So it looks something like this. It looks something like, where it's first increasing and you have an apex, you have like an intensity range at some percentage or some fraction of your threshold intensity, right? At which is this maximum. And then to complete the picture, obviously, when you exercise above maximum lactate steady state, which basically is what you did in your sprint, in your surge, in your high intense effort, then actually you have an increase of lactate, right? So the higher your intensity is above threshold, the higher the accumulation rate of lactate. Okay, so this is basically how it looks like if you go from rest to maximum lactate steady state and above. Okay, so now what do we do in a practical application with this information, with what we just learned? Well, I would argue there are 2 scenarios where this is important. One thing is monitoring performance, monitoring your progress in training. Because again, remember what we said initially, the ability to recover during exercise from accumulated lactate, to recover, to clear lactate that you accumulated is really crucial in many, if not most, sporting competitions. So that means, going back here, what you want is, as an athlete, in terms of higher performance, you want this apex of the clearance rate to be as high as possible, right? Basically, the higher this curve, the faster the athlete can clear lactate. Okay, so you want this one here to go to a pretty high rate, okay? To give you an example, very well-trained athletes can clear about 1 millimole of lactate per minute. Some experts maybe even a little bit more. Sedentary, untrained people, it's less than half of it, okay? So what does this mean? Think about it this way. Let's say, as an example, because of a high intense effort, either in training or racing, your lactate jumped from a resting concentration of, let's say, 1.5 to 8.5. So you have an accumulated extra lactate, 1.5 to 8.5 in this example of 7. Now, if you are able to clear at 1 millimole per minute, it takes you, roughly speaking, 7 minutes to go back from 8.5 to 1.5. Now imagine your ability to clear lactate is not that well developed, and you're not clearing a rate of 1.0 millimoles per minute, but you're only clearing at 0.5, then obviously going down 7 millimoles from 8.5 to 1.5 will not take you 7 minutes, but 40 minutes, double the time, obviously. And now picture that in a race situation, in a competition where one athlete recovers twice as fast as another athlete, right? So the ability to recover from that and being able to then launch the next attack, launch the next surge earlier is very crucial for the outcome of your competition, obviously. Okay, so one thing you want to do is, by training, you want to increase this apex. So the other aspect you want to think about is not only how fast you can recover, meaning how high the apex of this curve is, but the other question you want to look at is, at which intensity is that happening? Let me give you an example. Let's imagine the curve would look like this. So the same apex, but it is decreasing like this. This means the maximum clearance rate, the rate at which the athlete in this example here can recover, is the same rate, but it happens at a much lower intensity. And in a competition, it's not like you are able to choose the intensity, right? If the race dictates a certain speed, a certain power output, you have to deal with that. So the athlete with that curve, with the apex here being closer to the maximum lactate steady state, being closer to threshold, meaning happening at a higher power output, maximum lactate combustion or clearance rate happens closer to maximum lactate steady state, is obviously, a huge performance boost, a huge performance benchmark. So you want a higher maximum clearance rate, and you also want to have it further to the right, meaning at a higher exercise intensity, higher speed, higher power output, so on and so forth. Okay, so this is a situation where you can apply this knowledge to understand much, much better than only from a threshold value, which is again like a steady state value, which is never happening in most competitions. You can now understand, well, how good am I? How good is my athlete in recover from lactate? How fast can the athlete recover? And at which intensity, for example, as a percentage of threshold, can the athlete do that? So this is the application for racing, for competitions. Okay, now let's have a look at the other application of that, which is in training. You will likely prescribing or doing by yourself some kind of interval training. And in most cases, people have a very good idea about how long an interval should be and at what intensity it should be. But when it comes to the recovery period in between those intervals, meaning how long it should be and at which intensity, it's often like a blank spot, or in the best case, a gray area. Because this ability to recover from high lactate concentration, to clear lactate, to combust lactate, informs the duration of the recovery period and the intensity at which it should happen. Think about it this way. You want either a full recovery in between workouts, so you want all your systems going back to close to resting scenarios, resting lactate concentration, resting creatine phosphate, resting pH levels, heart rate, VO2, so on and so forth. Or you don't want that, depending on your training goal, right? You don't want a full recovery. You only want to have a partial recovery, right? So you can basically stack and compound and add on the effects from one interval to the other. It's not about what your goal is and what exactly you're trying to do, but the point I'm trying to make is, if you don't know how fast the athlete recovers and which intensities, and how are you actually able to prescribe that in training? How do you determine if the recovery between intervals should be 2 minutes or 4 minutes? And how do you determine if it should be at 200 watts or 150 watts, or 9 minutes per mile or 7 minutes per mile? Without knowing the clearance and combustion rate, this is hardly possible. And again, similar example, if your athlete has a lactate clearance, lactate combustion curve, which looks like this, then you could argue, okay, well, my fastest recovery is here, right? This is the apex of the curve. This is where the clearance rate, right, is the highest. So I choose this one here as my intensity for recovery. Fair enough. And then if you know that the athlete clears, for example, again, making this example let's say 1.0 millimoles per liter per minute, then you can also determine how long a recovery period should be. But what happens, for example, if the recovery curve, and that is a real world example, would look like this? Then the apex is at a lower intensity, so you would have to reduce the power output or running speed or whatever you exercise in the recovery period, plus it takes longer, right? Maybe it's only at 0.6 millimole per minute. So if you have this information, you can really make tailored individual interval training programs with a recovery period which is really based on the unique physiology of the athlete and really triggering the training adaptations that you want. Again, a full recovery or non-full recovery. So therefore, this is really important to have really the training effects that you want to have and not leave it up to chance and just prescribe some kind of recovery, right? Because the training effect, the training stimulus will drastically change. So in order to use this knowledge, there are two great tools. One tool is looking at actually this kind of graph. Looking at this graph where you have the power output in cycling or running speed or swimming speed on the x-axis of an individual athlete, and have the lactate clearance rate, which is then actually in millimoles per liter per minute, right, on the y-axis. So that's one way to use it. And this is really useful when you want to prescribe training programs and have individual recovery periods. But if you want to look at the progress of an athlete, if you want to understand if an athlete has improved the ability to combust lactate, to clear lactate, or if you want to compare two different athletes, athlete A versus athlete B, it gets very difficult to just look at these curves, and it's time consuming, it's not accurate, so on and so forth. And then you have things at play at like economy or efficiency, which affects the running speed, for example, as a fraction of MLSS and all these kind of things. So therefore, we created something which we call the recovery index. And the recovery index is actually looking at the apex of this curve. So it's looking at how high is that lactate combustion, right? What's you actually want? You want to increase it. And it's also looking at the Y position, so to speak, that's the clearance rate. And it's also looking at the power output. So it's also looking at which intensity, power or speed, this maximum clearance, this maximum combustion rate of lactate is happening. And it combines it into one single number. And therefore, without the need to look at the graphs and overlay graphs and having the problem of, for example, different body weights and cycling, you don't need all that, right? Without doing that, you have one simple number that basically says, okay, here's a compound score which combines how high is this recovery curve and at which intensity that is happening. And that intensity is metabolic energy expenditure. Sounds clunky. What is behind is that it is the energy turnover of the muscles. So it's independent of how fast somebody swims with that, or how fast somebody runs with that, or what power output somebody has with that, okay? It's normalized to the body weight, and it's the metabolic energy turnover. Think about kilocalories or kilojoules per hour per minute, right? And the huge advantage of that is that you can now actually compare athletes across different disciplines. You can compare athletes across different genders and different body weights, because again, it's normalized for body weight, it's normalized for gender, and because it's metabolic energy turnover, you can even compare a cyclist to a runner, to a swimmer, to a triathlete, to a football player, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is what the recovery index does for you. On one glance, you can basically understand how fast an athlete can recover from high lactate concentration, so how fast an athlete can combust lactate. And secondly, you can understand at which intensities the athlete can do that. And that's all compounded in the one recovery index.